Our first speaker, Dr. Greg Moore, Senior Research Associate, Burnley College, University of Melbourne. He was Principal of Burnley from 1988 to 2007. Greg is a horticulturalist with a particular interest in trees, inaugural President of the International Society of Arboriculture Australian Chapter, and has been a member of so many committees and boards, Greening Australia, TreeNet and Trust for Nature, that if we enumerated them all, we would be here for quite a long time. But Greg has fought the good fight for 3 decades and is still there, and his title today is Trees in the Urban Battleground. So please welcome Dr. Greg Moore.
We're starting a bit early, so I presume that means I have extra time. Sorry, that was a joke. Delighted to be here, and this is a topic that I've not spoken on before, and I feel a little bit guilty in a way because this is allowing me what might be seen as some self-indulgence. I've never sort of looked back before and talked about some of the battles that we've had over trees in Melbourne since the 70s. And so I'm not quite sure how this is going to come across, and I'm not quite sure how relevant this is. But I did enjoy sort of having a think about things and trying to work out whether there were any lessons to be learnt. And the first thing I wanted to begin with, and this is, I have a postcard collection, quite a significant postcard collection, which I started collecting in 1959. And occasionally I dip into these postcards for various reasons. And you can see this one is a postcard of Melbourne back in around a bit before 1920. And the next one, of course, is a recent shot. And it reminded me that cities change. And I wonder, are we opposed to change? And of course I'm not. I don't think you are either. We want to live in a city that is amenable. But we do understand that our cities are going to change. We understand from time to time trees are going to disappear and hopefully new trees will reappear. But I'm concerned because I think it's often forgotten what trees do and how important they are. And so I just thought I'd put up a few things to perhaps set the scene for today, and others can take up these various issues in much greater detail with much greater knowledge than I. But I think that we often forget the links that trees provide through time and that they span several to many human generations. For example, I well remember certain trees, some still existing in Melbourne and some up in regional Victoria, that I went to with my grandfathers in particular. I remember the trees. I remember why we were there. I remember the family occasions. And it's the trees that bring those memories back and make a connection to me through space and through time. I think the sense of permanence that trees provide in an ever-changing world is really important to us as people and to our psychology and our role in the places that we occupy and where we live. I think that because trees are large and alive and awesome, they have a whole range of intimate biological connections with us. And I don't think there's anything wrong with someone wandering up to a tree and just being impressed by that tree. I've been at Burnley, as you know, since 1979. It's getting on for a long time. And I have never walked past the Agathis robusta without being impressed. It's on the National Trust Register of Significant Trees, and I have to say that frequently I cannot resist the temptation to touch the trunk of that tree, to look at the bark, to have a look at this flake. Is it going to come off? Why is that patch orange and another bit green? Those sorts of things. And I've done that regularly, or not every week, but many times a year since 1979. The beauty that inspires, I think, is another part of our human context, and I'm working with a doctoral student at the moment who's working on trees as symbol and as trees as art. And I have a great fondness for seeing trees in artworks and how people saw trees in the past, how they see them in the present. My own family came to Victoria in the 1840s. They have a homestead up at Eganstown. They were indeed the Egans. And there is a portrait, if you like, of the homestead with some of the eucalypts. And I look at those eucalypts in that painting, and I can look at the same eucalypts today, 180 years later, and it's interesting to see how they compare and what's happened with those trees. And in one case, you could virtually take the tree from the painting, superimpose it on the photograph, and they are the same, okay? 180 years later. It makes me wonder how accurate our ageing of some trees are. And of course, we have the great heritage and history. I love this tree. River Red Gum, East Melbourne, 1885. I didn't take this photo. River Red Gum, same River Red Gum, 1985. I did take this photo. By 2:05, the tree was gone. And a great link with our pre-colonial history, with the history of the site long before Melbourne was even conceived, was lost. And the interesting thing about this tree, when it died, people sort of estimated its age at 400, and everyone said, well, it's had a pretty fair innings, 400's pretty good. Well, is it? Is it good for a river red gum that might have been there for 800 years or more? And in this case, I can tell you that we do know some of the things that contributed to its demise. Soil compaction and some bad pruning jobs are being amongst them. Now, the other thing I thought I might throw up is just a little bit of data. And this is a study now getting on a little bit, you can see, done in 2000 by one of my honours students, James Mullally, well-known arborist around Melbourne for some of you. And what I got James to do was to look at two parts of Melbourne in terms of the urban tree cover and to compare the two, 1993 to the year 2000. As far as I know, this is the only data of its kind for Melbourne. And what it basically tells you is that there has been a loss of canopy cover. And the rate of loss varies. When we set this up, you can imagine why we chose Richmond, close to Burnley. Okay, poor student doesn't have to travel, gets data quickly and easily. And what we were hypothesising is that Richmond would be a real sad case. All of the old houses were being demolished, intense urban development, and we knew lots of good trees that had been lost from private open space. So we figured that Richmond would be a cot case and we'd be able to tell people how many trees had been lost and how the cover had declined in Richmond. And then we thought, well, you know, the green and leafy suburb of Balwyn would be a good comparison because that's green and leafy and nothing much has happened out there. Well, isn't it interesting? At the end of the day, we discovered that Richmond was fine, pretty much. The trees that had gone from private open space, the council had been popping trees in all over the place. Streets that never had them, little park here, put an extra tree. And they more or less, not quite, but they more or less compensated. But out at Balwyn, you were losing 1% of your canopy cover on average every year. And no one was noticing. Okay? So I think this is really significant data. And of course, what happens in a place like Richmond, eventually you fill up all the public open spaces. There are no opportunities for tree planting, and so there is a limit to how far we can go with this. In Balwyn, you may ask, well, that was nearly 10 years ago now, what's it like today? So I rang one of my contacts at Balwyn and said, look, we said you were losing about 10% tree cover. Do you think things have changed? And his response was, yes, it's worse. So they're going to lose more than that 1% per year. And some of you from that part of Melbourne would know that you already have. So there are significant losses. So here is an issue for us to confront. We are losing vegetation. Now, as a consequence of that, some years ago, I started to take an interest in the functional aspects. And this is a bit of the philosophy of this. You eventually battle for so long, and if you can't win, you think, right, I'll play the bastards at their own game. And the bastards I'm talking about here are the economists. If you can't put a dollar value on things, then at the end of the day, you don't really have a role in decision making. And so I've been trying to work out what is the value of shade, how much shade preserves the life of bitumen, how much that's worth in dollar terms. What does a tree on a steep block of land that consolidates the land and prevents landslip, what does that worth? And I'm not the only person who's doing this. In other parts of the world, they're way in front of the sorts of things that I can even contemplate or consider. And so we've been looking at the role of trees, the functional and service aspects of trees, you know, real dollar value. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that this is the only value. When I go to a place like Melrose in South Australia, I couldn't give a fig, if you pardon the pun, about the value, the dollar value of those Melrose trees. Their intrinsic value is all that matters. They are absolutely superb. But if I'm going to talk to people from Vic Roads, to people in the accounts department, to people on councils, it's the dollar that underpins their decision making. And I am enjoying having some figures that I can joust back with them, that I can clout them around the ears and say, well, that's what you assert. Can you disprove my argument on the basis of my figures? So trees do all sorts of things in terms of the amenity, the humanising of the landscape. And of course, for our kids, trees provide a sense of space and adventure and mystery. When my kids were small, you'd take them down to the park and they could disappear from your sight in 3 seconds behind a tree, and as far as they were concerned, you were gone and they were free. And as far as I was concerned, I knew that they were free, but I knew exactly where they were and what I could do. Those sorts of things are sometimes lost. Now, I'm going to go on about some of this, and I'm going to remind you that this looks like something that I wrote on the back of an envelope, because it's something I wrote on the back of an envelope. And I can talk about any one of those dot points in terms of the values and the benefits and sometimes the economics for somewhere between, let's say, 3 hours and 3 weeks each. Now, I'm not going to do that today, tempted though I might be. But I wanted to remind you that there are so many things that you can think of, and I haven't got them all up there. That is the dots on the end, on the back of an envelope. So, why are trees important? Why are there battlegrounds? How do we see this sort of thing going? Well, the first thing I wanted to point out to you is the tree cover of Melbourne is not as great as most people think. If you ask Melburnians, they think we live in a green and leafy suburb. We don't. Brisbane's better. Adelaide's better. London is a forest. How can we let that happen? In a place like Australia, where we don't have that same intensity. You go to London, and as an Australian, you notice immediately that the tree cover is there. Why? Because there's no above-ground cables. Their services are underground. Their canopies are free. Why can't we do that here? And why shouldn't we be doing that here? On the whole, the greater city of Melbourne has a cover just under 20%. And from my own part of Melbourne, and I wasn't going to mention this, but we were discussing it before the day, in the city of Brimbank where I live, you'll love this, the cover is 6%. They're aspiring to 20%. That's their aspiration. You only get the benefits of increased tree cover from a climate change perspective with cover of 30%. In the old part of Sunshine, the cover is 13.5%. Most people wouldn't think of Sunshine as being a tree-covered suburb, but out in the city of Brimbank, it has the high tree cover. Derrimut, a brand new estate of several thousand homes, has a cover under 6%, and they counted the number of trees on private land. 150 trees on private property. 150. And the question was asked at a planning panel, how many trees will there be on private property in the future? And the answer is 150. Why? Because there's no space for them anywhere else. They're there now, they won't be there in the future. And the problem is, all of the ameliorating benefits that you can get from good tree cover are going to be virtually unattainable in that new suburb. And is it causing a concern for the local council? You betcha. Is it causing a concern for the Department of Health? You betcha. So these issues have to be confronted because, despite what some people think, what we do in terms of our vegetation and our open space management is a matter of life and death. Don't forget that. This is not just about aesthetics. This is not just about heritage. This is not just about culture. For some people, the vegetation will make a difference to how long they live, and in some cases with the elderly, whether they live or not. So it is a matter of real significance. The same sort of patterns, by the way, of lower tree canopy cover than we think are manifest right around our nation. So, you know that you can write tables like this. And I vary this table all over the place. I talk about the benefits of shade, the advantages in flood mitigation, carbon emissions, health, cultural benefits in terms of lower graffiti, lower vandalism, lower domestic violence. I talk about all sorts of attributes, and I know that I'm barely touching the surface. And for some of these, we can actually put dollar values. I'm not going to do that today because it's not the nature of the talk. But what I do want you to understand is that vegetation is not just ornamental. I hate the word ornamental because in my mind, something that's ornamental, it automatically goes to it's decorative, it automatically goes to it's optional. I don't like the term ornamental, and I won't use the term green infrastructure either. I will the moment the road engineers talk about black and concrete infrastructure, and the sewerage and water people talk about, for want of a better word, brown infrastructure. If they're going to colour code the system, that's fine for me. But if they use the word green infrastructure, for me, that's code for unimportant, not as important. And as far as I'm concerned, infrastructure is infrastructure. Vital infrastructure is vital infrastructure. And our vegetation, our parks and open spaces and our trees are vital infrastructure that are to be protected at all costs. And I remind you that on Black Saturday, 172 Victorians died in a fire, but 374 died in the heat wave. And the Department of Health in this state did a correlation which showed that those people from these demographics at the bottom came largely, when they looked at the map, they put all the little red dots of the deaths, and the single greatest correlation with those red dots was lack of woody trees, lack of woody vegetation cover. And they now use that as a predictor and as an indicator of what might happen during a heat wave. Parts of Melbourne that have no significant tree cover, the Department of Health knows about, when a heat wave is on the way, they warn the ambulances and the hospitals in those regions to expect a greater number of heat-related ambulance call-outs, hospitalisations and deaths. It's all based on tree cover. The Department of Health is pushing, for example, Western and some southern councils down around Dandenong to increase their tree canopy cover because of health concerns, not because of the greeny environmental so-called concerns. Now, trees in the battleground. Victoria, there is very little legislation that protects our trees. There is certainly protection for native trees growing on undisturbed regional and rural land, in other words, remnant vegetation. And some of this legislation can be evoked when trees are removed in the peri-urban and fringe areas of country towns. There's no real legislation that protects trees, although, of course, common law and property law may apply. And as far as I can tell, and I notice there are people in this audience who have much greater expertise on this than I, the only way I've been able to work with councils and others to protect trees is through their planning, the local government planning schemes and planning overlays. And it would be fair to say that one of the reasons I jumped at this opportunity to speak today is I have written to every council in the state at least 3 times in my role with the National Trust and the Register of Significant Trees, saying, if you've got significant trees, put them on your planning schemes, protect them with planning overlays, do something to protect them. And I have been virtually completely disappointed with the response. Almost no council has done it, and I'll explain the consequences of that in a minute. The legal framework has changed over the last 30 years. Heritage Victoria, for example, has legislation that would protect trees. But the truth is, there are a dozen nominations that protect trees under Heritage Victoria. Some of those have hundreds of trees, and so Heritage Victoria might actually say, well, we protect several thousand trees. Yeah, but 2,500 of them are in the Avenue of Honour at Ballarat. And when it comes down, it's a relatively small number. Now, their function is not to protect trees. I know that. So I'm just saying it's one of the things that you can do. The National Trust has a significant tree register, which we've been maintaining continuously now for in excess of 30 years. And it provides a moral but not legal protection. Don't you love the way I've worded that? Deep down, I am a politician, you know. A moral persuasion, because we have you been able to use it to protect trees, and sometimes with wonderful effectiveness, I have to say. Usually, when we quietly go behind the scenes and explain the way things could work with people, we've been quite successful, much more often than you might think. But it's still no legal protection. Local government registers only protect trees when they are included in planning overlays and in their planning codes. Some councils have them, fantastic, many don't, many don't. So the best way of protecting a tree is to include it on a planning overlay. A few little bits of data that I've got. We record trees, as you know, on the basis of their significance. The idea was to try and save them, protect them, where possible extend their lifespans, and where also possible to improve their management. But in truth, we work on a very, very limited budget. You'll be pleased to know for the last 10 years at least, the Register of Significant Trees has a budget of no dollars. Okay, so we've done wonderful work on a budget of no dollars. We have some wonderful volunteers, and in-kind contributions are very, very significant indeed. We've got good criteria, and you probably all know about this. We're supposed to classify at a local, regional and state level. We simply cannot do it at local level. We don't have the resources. We just can't do it. I've sent letters off, as you can see, 3 times. Sadly, very few councils doing the job. No protection from the register, and we send the list to relevant authorities in the hope that the utility companies, road organisations and the like will know that they've got a significant tree and will take some note of it. Does that always work? No. Does it afford protection? Yes. Have we saved trees with it? Yes. Have we stopped people doing work? Yes. Have trees been damaged and then we've called a halt to it? Yes. So all of those things are possible, but you can see that's terribly hit and miss. And it comes down to the politics and the lobbying. The large-scale tree removers in our state are roadworks. Vic Roads is, after the timber companies, probably the biggest clearer of vegetation in the state. They have a significant forest under their control along our roadways, and they are very, very major clearers. Utility companies do a lot of tree removal. You'd be surprised how many trees they remove in the regions and in rural Victoria, not so much in the city, unless they can get away with it, of course. And lots of trees have been removed under the guise of fire protection. City of Casey, for example, would be a classic. And then there's the urban development, and although developers get an awful lot of stick, and so they should, and I'd be happy to take a stick to quite a few of them at any time, the number of trees they actually really bugger up, relatively small compared to these other, what I'll call villains will do. Villains describe them pretty well. And then you've got the insurance companies who are obsessed, absolutely obsessed with risk, without actually assessing the tree to find out whether it does pose any real hazard or risk, and lots of trees have been lost because of that. Now, some of the major battles we've had over the last 30 years are the Punt Road trees. How many in the room remember the Punt Road tree battle? Great, great, a few of you. Not a lot. Geez, I'm getting older. Okay, I'll drop that one off the list from now on. The Bacchus Marsh Avenue of Honour. How often do we battle about that? About every 10 years. About every 10 years. I reckon we fight them, we have a big battle, we sometimes lose, we sometimes win. Flinders Park, you remember Flinders Park? How many people remember Flinders Park before the tennis centre? Look, oh, jeepers creepers, hardly anyone. Isn't that interesting? It's the tennis centre. Then we've got Albert Park. You all remember Albert Park, so I'm not going to ask. Don't need to wake you up with a show of hands on that one. Citylink, Vic Roads, of course, suburban development and freeway construction. So these are some of the major battles. And I'm just going to go through a couple now. The first one I wanted to talk about was Gosh's Paddock. Gosh's Paddock. Do you all know Gosh's Paddock? Green and leafy, that's it today. Every elm along the Punt Road was to go. And they were all to go. Why? So you could come down Punt Road at 2 kilometres faster and get to the lights just before the railway bridge and bank up there instead of one set of lights back for virtually no gain. And there was a protest, and I'm pleased to see that a number of you remember it. Roger Skipton, one of the local members, was actively involved. The trees were saved. I can remember being filmed protesting about this removal, and I made the assertion that there were 50 elms, they were worth at least $20,000 each, and that was $1 million of our tree sort of infrastructure disappearing. And it was filmed and it went on to Channel 7. I didn't know I was being filmed, and I didn't know until the following Monday that they'd put it in the news, because I don't watch that sort of stuff. Anyway, I got a phone call from a person from Vic Roads and said, "Are those elms really worth $1 million?" I said, "Yes." I said, "Who are you?" He said, "I'm doing the design for the road." And I said, "Well, why didn't you take account of the elms?" He said, "They're not on my plan." I said, "What do you mean they're not on your plan?" He said, "No, they're not on my plan." So I said to him, "What's on your plan?" And see that fence, that pipe fence, that was on his plan. The footpath was on his plan. The curbing was on his plan. And when I said to him, "So what's with the pipe fence?" He knew how much per metre that fence was worth. And so they were going, so I said to him, "Well, if the trees are $1 million worth, what would you do?" He said, "Oh, well, we'll widen on the other side of the road." And I said, "Can you do that?" And he said, "Oh, yeah." I said, "Why didn't you do it in the first place?" He said, "I didn't know the elms were there." I said, "Haven't you been to the site?" He said, "No." He said, "No." And do you know what they did? They went the other way, and the elms are still there. 5 went, but the other 50 remained. It was an astonishing eye-opener, and that was when I realised that money talks. Every asset on that site, the rubbish bins and the seats, had a value. The trees, so valueless, they didn't appear on his plan. Now, remember, that's back in the 80s. But we saved Gosh's Paddock, and it's quite a splendid part of Melbourne these days. Now, do you all know about Citylink? Citylink is interesting. Citylink is not a tunnel, because for a lot of it they cut and filled. So the Citylink tunnels involved cut and fill component, and they would be a lot of trees that would be lost along the Olympic Park area of the Yarra Bank. But the government said, "Hang on, we're not going to have another Albert Park here." Now the moral here is significant, isn't it? Because many people would say that the Albert Park protesters fought a great but losing battle. Well, no, they didn't. They had a whole range of consequences. There was a ripple effect. And Jeff Kennett didn't want an issue related to the trees along the Yarra. And so 7 elms were lifted, stored in Olympic Park, put back, an extra 50 trees, and they're still there. An extra 50 trees were planted just in case those 50 didn't survive. And this is some of those trees. Now, interestingly enough, the conversation went like this. I got a phone call. The person at the end said, "I'm from," I think it was Transfield. I said, "Yes." Never heard of Transfield, by the way. He said, "We're building the Citylink." "Right. I've been told to ring you." "Oh, you're supposed to know something about trees." "Yes." "Right. We're going to lift the elms for this tunnel." I said, "Oh, yeah. So we're going to do it. How do we do it?" And I explained. He said, "Well, no, we're going to lift them in 12 weeks. What's the chance of success?" I said, "You've got no chance of success." Clunk. That was it. Finish. No chance of success. So he hung up. I thought, that's interesting. So about 3 days later, I get another phone call. "Say we gave you 6 months." I said, "No, 6 months is not going to work either." seasons. You need to prepare a year ahead. Expletive deleted. You don't know anything about this. This isn't I'm on a tight budget. We're not around with trees. Clunk. End of conversation. And I thought, well, that's a relief. You know, I don't often get sworn at by someone I don't know in a role that I'm getting absolutely no sort of recognition for. He rang back the next day and said, we'll give you a year and a half. How many trees will survive? And I said, all of them. And they're all there. You can do it. No. Amazing the politics must have been going on behind the scenes. Can you imagine? I may have been involved. I didn't win anything on that. I just simply said, if you want an honest answer, and then I sent them off a guide to how to do it. So they're all there, and think about how different this precinct would be. Some of these trees are not in great nick, I admit that. Some of them are good. I could tell you some stories about these. You spend a fortune saving them. I went down there just after they'd been put back in. They all had super sophisticated irrigation, and one of the irrigation lines had been cut, and so the tree didn't get any water for the first 4 weeks because no one went down to the site because they had all the data coming back to the office, and the office said they were being irrigated, and so they were, except the water wasn't getting to them. And I like this slide. I'm a terrible photographer, and this is looking along the banks of the Yarra, and some of the trees at the far end were those transplanted. But why have I included this photograph? See that gum tree? It was to go. And I said to the guys at one stage, you know, you could leave that gum tree if you move the tunnel about 3 or 4 metres. And the guy said, all right, we'll do that. And I said to them, what? And he said, oh yeah, there are certain stages. We haven't actually pinned this down to the exact location. He said a couple of metres here or there at this stage doesn't matter. And I can see some of you that working in local government go, yes. If I'd got in touch with him or he'd got in touch with me 2 weeks later, not possible. Okay, so they just moved it a fraction, didn't even disturb the tree, and it's doing fine. The National Tennis Centre. Who remembers Flinders Park before the National Tennis Centre? Now, I wanted to put this up for a reason. You know that the elms in front of the National Tennis Centre, the mature ones, were part of the architect's vision and drawing? Did you know that? And so do you know the entrance up that stair to the National Tennis? You were supposed to come through a green and leafy. And in the construction, they lost the lot. And so when the architect saw the site, he went, what have you done? And they said, oh, it's just trees. But the whole ambience of the entry changed. The whole scale to humanise that site changed. And the architect wasn't a happy Vegemite. And subsequently, they've put some young elms back, as you know, and they're doing quite well. But can you imagine what the architect must think? What's that bloody thing doing there? That relocatable. What's that out the front for? You've got a really significant building. You've got really important public open space. And we've got 2, what I consider to be containers, on one of the premier pieces of public open space that should be a testament to what Flinders Park was, not what it is. You know, and I think we shouldn't let them get away with it. It's pretty ordinary. And you know, this is what the site is today, manicured to within an inch of its sort of life. So Birrarung Ma was offered, do you remember this? We took Flinders Park, we're going to give you back some open space. Now, you can argue whether Birrarung Ma is compensation, but it has the potential to be a really fine piece of public open space, as far as I'm concerned. You'll notice that I've used the word potential. The potential to be really fine open space, which probably suggests that I don't think it's realised that potential at the moment. But even then, do you remember what they did to the riverside elms? The architect's design? So, you know this part of Birrarung Ma. You can see the elms here running along the river, and at certain times of the year you can see that they're not looking too flash. By the way, Birrarung Ma, another site. Do you reckon someone should have said to the contractors, how about not driving over the sand? You know, how about not... And this happens to me all the time. I'm in parks. I can see where a vehicle has gone over turf and shrubs very often 6 months later, because the tissue is injured, and when you have a frosty morning, respiratory rates are different, and you can actually see the tracks where the vehicles have gone. Doesn't anyone tell contractors this whole effect is lost, don't you think? You're not looking at the bells, you're not looking at the ambience, you're not looking at the juxtaposition of the installation and the city behind. What you're looking at is some bozo who's basically done donuts on a public landscape. Now we get to the elms themselves. Every arborist in this room is looking at those and going, what happened to the trunk flare, Greg? And there is no trunk flare. Look at that. They go into the ground just like the power poles. Now, I don't know whether everyone intended them to disappear into the ground, but you know that that granitic sand level has been brought up. Did you know that the arborists working for the Melbourne City Council battled furiously to reduce the height so that the fill wasn't even further up the trunk of the trees? Did you know that? You probably didn't. So, yep, good, thank you. I'm bang on time, very happy to hear the bell. And this is just making the point that we were promised compensation and there was really goodwill over Birrarung Ma. The designers, every intention is honourable, no doubt about that. And yet in the execution, just a little bit of technical advice that didn't come their way jeopardises the really important infrastructure along the riverside there. I'm not going to talk about Albert Park, I don't need to. All I wanted to say to you with Albert Park is that very often people talk about that ongoing protest and they talk about, well, it hasn't made a difference. But from my perspective, it has. And so from my perspective, the battles are worth the fight. You may not win every battle, and you may not even win the war as you understand it. But the one thing I can tell you is we will win. I hope we win in my lifetime, because I'm one of those people that would love to be able to say, I told you so. That's what I said in 1970. I can imagine myself, a crotchety old bugger, going, well, I've been talking about that since 1972. You know, that sort of thing. I want to have that privilege. But we will win. We will win. Why? Because we have to. There is no choice in this. As John said in his introduction, people recognise the need for vegetation and public open space. What we haven't worked out yet is how to do it in the face of some conflicting values in terms of housing, real estate and the development of open space. Just as a matter of interest, of all the trees on our register, we have only lost 7 because of development, a private development, only 7, which suggests that if people do look after things. Now I'm going to finish with a scenario, all too familiar scenario. We've got a threatened tree, poorly managed development, something. The local community objects. Tree's not protected by inclusion under a planning overlay or other relevant city ordinance. So what happens? Even if the government, the local government now supports the retention of the tree, there's virtually nothing you can do. You go to VCAT and you will virtually always lose because VCAT will say, did the council follow due procedure? The answer is yes. Were the trees protected prior to the development proposal? The answer is almost always no. They're not ruling on the merits of the tree, they're ruling on the process. And so what you've got to do is make sure that the merits of your vegetation are well and truly enhanced, documented and protected before the threat is there. Nationally, 97% of the trees that are removal requests are made for are approved by local council. 97%. That's virtually carte blanche. May not be first time. Victoria, we are much better because we're the greenest state. It's only 95% here. And what we're finding is that we simply don't do the right thing if we don't put these trees on planning overlays and registers. And finally, many ways we get what we deserve. Too few people understand the real benefits of what trees provide. The one thing we can be sure about is that the future will be different. There will be a role of trees, and we owe it to the future generations of Australians to do the right thing and to provide them with a green and leafy future.